Lotfullah Najafizada, thank you so much for joining us from Kabul. Now, many of us just don't have words to describe what happened at that wedding just 2 days, or less than 2 days before Independence Day, where dozens of civilians, men, women, and children were killed. It was absolutely horrendous, and we saw your reporting from TOLO News as well. These are not just numbers. These are people and families that have been shattered for life.
I agree with you, Amitabh. The Afghan people have been going through so much, not just in the past few days, but not just in the past few months and years, but for decades. And we have seen it and experienced it personally, at family, at work, the larger society, and you feel it very, very personally when you realize this is not just numbers, as you said. Now, we have lost 11 colleagues to similar attacks just in the past 3 years alone. Afghanistan, especially in the past year or so, has seen an intensified level of violence, especially complex attacks. And you can't really describe the nature of such attacks at the wedding hall the other day. And you can't really describe it, why it happened, and what purpose it served, apart from injecting fear and intimidation in the society.
Now, this desensitization that even sometimes creeps into reporters who have been covering war zones and conflict zones, especially in Afghanistan. Just again, to put a human face to this, I saw a lot of reporting from TOLO about Mirwais, the tailor, the groom, and how he continuously said that he thought that this would have been the happiest day of his life, but it's turned out to be a complete nightmare for him, his wife, and his family and friends, and of course, all the others involved.
Yes, he was an ordinary man. I mean, he is an ordinary man. He was a tailor, as you said. And for him, he said in his interview that for him to find that 250,000 apps, which is an equivalent of 2.5 lakh Indian rupees, it took him years to find that money, and then sold that partly for his relatives and family members. So that day was not an ordinary day for him. It took him a very, very long time to put that together. And all of that dreams, shattered, and his family is going through so much, and he is going through so much. He said something very, very painful the other day. He said, even if you turn his body into pieces and then send it to families of those people who lost their loved ones at his wedding, their pain would not be, would not go away. So you wonder, how is he going to feel for the rest of his life?
This pain that you're talking about for Mirwais, his family, and thousands of others over the decades that's happened in Afghanistan, you were mentioning it's senseless, except for the fact that it wants to instill fear of some sort. This particular attack, coming in the light of what's happening in the larger picture in Afghanistan, with the US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad having 8 rounds of talks. How do Afghans really feel about that? There's a peace process being negotiated in some manner, but the bloodshed and the violence is just not stopping.
Right. I think all Afghans want an end to the current violence, senseless violence, which is happening not just in Kabul, but throughout the country. And we hope as Afghans that the ongoing peace efforts on the US front, as well as hopefully in the near future on the Afghan front, will bring an end to the ongoing tragedy here. But we also shouldn't forget that Taliban is not just the only party to violence and intimidation and fear and to what's happening in this country for so long. I think if you really think about a lasting peace in Afghanistan, then you should also address other causes of violence in this country. The attack, the wedding hall was claimed by Daesh. And you may question that, where is the role of Daesh in the current peace process? So I think the negotiation with the Taliban is one step forward, but it's not the only step required to bring Afghanistan to a lasting peace.
Again, what do Afghans feel when Zalmai Khalilzad tweets soon after that attack, saying that, of course, condemning the attack, condemning ISIS or Daesh, but saying it's more imperative for the peace agreement to move forward so that Afghans can fight against Daesh?
I think all Afghans feel very confused every time such an attack happens, and especially for people who are experiencing it very personally. But if you are thinking very logically about it, I think he is right that such attacks should not stop the efforts to lead Afghanistan to a peace process, because ultimately the ongoing conflict in this country requires a political settlement. And that political settlement will only happen if all parties to conflict sit down and agree on some form of a political settlement. It might be difficult, right? It might be difficult to face the other party when you know that you have suffered personally, your society has suffered, the larger Afghan society has been going through so much. It's not a very popular act, especially on particular days when a lot of Afghans lose their lives. But what is the alternative, right? So there has to be a political settlement, which hopefully will bring the entire war to a close.
That's the hope that Afghans in the region and the world would really want to happen. But if you look at it in the past, say, for example, somebody of the nature of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, he was involved in violence for a long time. And now he's in the political process. Is there a worry that some elements of the Taliban could come into the political process in this peace framework, deal, whatever the words that come out of the actual agreement, whereas the violence will still continue by some other group, or a group that's using deniability by using another group's name?
I think there are two elements to this question. One element is that if you think that the peace deal with the Taliban will include all groups within the Taliban movement, how much would it affect the level of violence in the country? One. Second is, are there other groups like Daesh, for instance, that can continue a significant level of violence in this country or not? I think in both cases, you can argue whether a peace deal with the Taliban will significantly reduce violence or not. Our hope is that a deal with the Taliban will ultimately sort of pave the ground to bring peace, and then go after other groups who are irreconcilable. I think it's too early to say whether all members within the Taliban movement will accept the peace deal. If you talk to the Taliban, they might argue that last year during Eid, for instance, when they issued a statement, all members of the Taliban ceased violence and fighting for a few days. But some other days it may not be, it may not be the case. So I think we have to wait and see. But certainly the hope is that there has to be an inclusive deal on the Taliban side. It should include all groups and factions within the Taliban. And on the non-Taliban side, it should include the government. It should include political parties, and it can include other armed groups who may not actively be engaged in fighting today, but they have the potential to sort of disrupt the peace process.
But isn't the problem actually what has been talked about for so many years, that it's the safe havens, the sanctuaries, the training grounds outside Afghanistan that are the problem, and if you're not going after that, you're not going to solve the problem.
Exactly. I think, to talk very specifically, the role of Pakistan is critical, and other neighbors in the region who may have started harboring, anti-government or anti-state or anti-republic elements. I think if we don't address those questions, you're not talking about lasting peace. I think the regional consensus or the regional ratification and endorsement of the peace process is equally important. And you can't just make peace with one group and then tomorrow there's another group using similar facilities, similar financial support, training grounds that will not lead Afghanistan to peace. I think the concern of sanctuaries is very, very critical and legitimate. And our hope is that that should be a critical part of the peace process.
Lotfullah Najafizada, now when you're talking about specifically about Pakistan, there's also a view that these other groups, these so-called other groups, which essentially are either disgruntled Taliban or other extremist groups who have been drawn to this magnet of so-called ISIS or Daesh, will continuously be used because Pakistan is not willing to change.
I hope they change their policies. I do not engage with them directly, but I hear from the Americans, I hear from the Afghan government that there is this realization that peace in Afghanistan will benefit Pakistan as well. But this is not a new line that we hear. We have been hearing it on and off for so long. I think if that word turns into action, and we see serious changes on the ground, then I think both countries will benefit. Otherwise, this peace deal will certainly be something temporary. I think concerns of Pakistan should also be heard and addressed. Legitimate concerns, could be there. Same for India, same for Iran, same for our northern neighbors. I think these concerns, should be listened to. That is the responsibility of the Afghans and the Afghan government. But there has to be a regional consensus, as I said earlier, on how a peaceful Afghanistan can contribute to the region.
Ultimately, like you're saying, it's the Afghan people, the Afghan government, which will have to decide. But I remember one of your tweets soon after that horrific attack on the wedding ceremony, when you asked for help. When you're talking about a regional framework, what would you personally and what are Afghans really looking at in terms of India's engagement in this whole process?
I think India can certainly step up its engagement in the peace process. India has a lot of leverage, not just within Afghanistan, but in the region, also in the US and in the West. India is certainly a big player and luckily a very constructive player in Afghanistan. We have seen so much India's contribution in the development arena, for instance. And now that I think Afghans certainly appreciate more political engagement of India. I know that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump spoke recently about Afghanistan as well. So that certainly helps. And there should be more of that. We shouldn't forget that India is one of the most favorite countries, and I think Indians being one of the most loved nations within Afghans. So that very high approval rating and support should be used. I think on both sides.
You mentioned Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. Well, President Trump and Prime Minister Imran Khan also had talks twice on Afghanistan over the phone recently. But when you're talking about India and its leverage in terms of goodwill, its development, its ties with regional countries as well as the US, we've seen the Taliban not only in Doha, in Qatar, in Indonesia, in Uzbekistan, in China, in Iran, in Russia. Does India have a role in that sense as a neutral player where all parties know that we are not really involved on either side or looking to harm Afghanistan in any way, as a venue for some kind of talks either now or later in the peace process?
I think the principle of talking to the Taliban in order to convince them to join the peace process and help an acceptable peace for both sides to happen is a good thing, even if that requires or includes a Taliban delegation trip to a particular country. But dealing with two different governments or acting that there are two different systems in Afghanistan, I think that's at this stage I believe that's not helpful. But India can, I'm sure all countries talk to the Taliban. Afghans talk to the Taliban. I went to Doha and sat down and spoke with the Taliban for 2 days. That's a reality, and because we all want, to come to a peace agreement. I think not talking to the two sides of the conflict is not. You can't say you have an active role. But treating one party, especially the ones not in the government, not recognized as a legitimate group, would probably not very much help. But that shouldn't stop you from the principle of reaching out for helping the peace process.
When you mentioned that you talked to some Taliban leaders in Qatar, in Doha, what is the sense you got? Do they know what Afghanistan is now in terms of the change from 1996 and 2001? Do they know what Kabul is? Human rights, women's rights, schools, how much things have changed? Do they really know that? Were they asking you about it? Give us a sense of what really they wanted to know from you.
I hope they do. This country has such a vibrant media, for instance. There are nearly 100 TV channels. So there are, I think the statistics show that there were 200 hours of political debates on TV every 24 hours in this country. I think they watch that. I hope they watch that. I hope they see the country has changed so much since 2001. 2/3 of Afghans are under 25. They barely remember what happened during the Taliban regime. Afghanistan is the youngest country outside Africa in the entire world. I think these are the realities that you must take into consideration when you talk about lasting peace. I think the formula of the 90s and even late 80s would not copy paste of those peace formulas would not help because today is a different reality. I hope that all parties take that into consideration.
You're talking about the press and the vibrant press there, which I've had a great experience with, both television, print, regional. In some studies, Afghanistan has been shown to be way higher in the freedom of press, or the vibrancy of press, than even India. But that apart, how do you, in your view, look at the peace process moving on one side while the campaigning for the presidential polls, which is scheduled for the 28th of September, goes on the other? Are there two parallel tracks? Do they come at loggerheads?
I think that is a question to be addressed once a proper national negotiating team sat down with the Taliban. You can't stop a national process when there is no particular achievement on the peace front. So far, it's just the Americans talking to the Taliban. I think once the Afghans sit down with the Taliban, you can determine the speed of the process, how long it would take for the two sides to agree on something. I think that will be when you can really make a judgment whether election is an obstacle to the peace process or a support or an asset to the peace process. If you talk to President Ghani, he might argue that a government with a stronger mandate is helpful to the peace process. The Taliban may not want the elections to happen next month. I think let's wait for the direct negotiations to happen, and then see the speed of that. Whether that speed qualifies for postponement of the elections or not. But stopping the election process for something which might happen, which is going to happen in the future, I think it might be premature today. May not be premature tomorrow. Every day from today to the election date is crucial. So realities might change.
Realities might change, and I keep, whenever I have the opportunity, try to show a side of Afghanistan which is not really put out to the rest of the world. There's so much more than just suicide attacks and killings and the Taliban or the Daesh and terrorist groups, and maybe disunity among political factions in Afghanistan that happens everywhere. And I'm so grateful that TOLO News gave SNI the opportunity to put out that video, the rendition of the Afghan national anthem on the 100th anniversary of your independence. But there's so much more to Afghanistan as well. I mean, whether it's Bamiyan, cricket, the sports, culture, arts, singing, Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, there's so much more than just what the headlines grab.
I agree with you. Amitabh. I think that's critical for Afghans first to realize and appreciate that the country has moved so much forward in the past 2 decades. It's important for our neighbors to appreciate that and realize that and build on that and invest in it. It's important for the Taliban to realize that this country is not what it was 2 decades ago. 21 million cell phones in this country out of 30 million, population of 30 million. You go to the caves of Buddha in Bamiyan and people are watching live television. They may not have proper food on the dining table, but they have a satellite dish and using a solar panel to keep them updated. They are connected to the world. This is no longer an isolated population. We had a documentary from Pamir that our team had to walk basically for days to get there. But they had access to media, in the heights of Pamir. So this is just one. I think war is just one side of the story here, which is a very tragic side of it. I'm not trying to estimate the tragedy, but also there is another side of the society, which countries and particularly countries like India, which is interested not just in the war, but also in the peace side of the country as well. Has to appreciate that and see that, so you can have a better picture and a full picture of the country.
Lotfullah Najafizada, Manana, Tashakor for your time and speaking to us, and we hope to see you either in Delhi or Kabul very soon.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. Good to talk to you.
Inshallah.